Yeah.
So Dr. Moss is the director of the Peace Resource Center at Wilmington College, where she also teaches courses into the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japanese imperialism in East Asia. The Peace Resource Center is the largest holding of materials related to the atomic bomb. It's the largest archival source for peace studies and the atomic bombs outside of Japan. And Dr. Moss has been really active in organizing these archives, making them available to scholars, holding outreach events, and as we'll hear from her talk today, also kind of grappling with the legacy of the atomic bombings and the place of archives in preserving this history, and kind of the question of whose history and where it belongs. If you're interested in the Peace Resource Center, they do have a very strong social media presence on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and they do have some very interesting upcoming events that Dr. Moss may speak a little bit about today, so I don't want to spoil them right now. We can talk about them later, but I would encourage you to follow the social media as well. So without any further introduction, I'd like to welcome Dr. Moss to speak about her work today. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much to the organizers of SATAR, Katie Tanaka and Dana Fujimoto, and whoever else has been instrumental in creating this session. I really want to say how delighted I'm to be able to share this conversation with you. It's something that I think about often and work on often, and I haven't revisited it for a while. So this is such a good opportunity to me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts along the way. Feel free to jump in and ask questions as we go along. I understand there's also a longer question and answer period after the break. So either way is fine with me. Maybe we can save the larger picture discussion questions for later, but if you want clarification on a smaller point, then feel free to just stop me and ask away. So I'm going to share my screen with you here, and hopefully that will go without any incident. And then I'm going to put it on slideshow mode if it will cooperate. Okay, so today I am going to talk about, in particular, the repatriation of the Urakami Cross, as we call it at the Peace Resource Center in Nagasaki. They call it the Hibaku Jujika, or the atomic bombed cross. So I'm trying to get used to that designation. And one of the things I would like to sort of frame this conversation with is a couple of things. One is cultural heritage in terms of both tangible and intangible cultural heritage. And UNESCO sort of been leading the charge in terms of global cultural heritage, and they have they link their sort of progression back to conferences at The Hague in 1898, 1907, 1954, and 1999 for direction about cultural heritage, especially in terms of military conflict, but also in terms of repatriation of cultural heritage to First Peoples or Indigenous populations. And so some of the conversation takes place within that context. In the United States, the 1990 Native American Graves Repatriation Act has also stimulated a lot of conversation about recognizing the rights of First Peoples, American Indians in the United States to reclaiming physical bodies that were taken out of sacred sites, but in addition to sort of the bodies of, or the corpses, or I'm sorry, the remains of such individuals, also reclaiming cultural artifacts at the same time. So there's been a lot of momentum coming out of the 1990 NAGPRA Act. And a lot of that momentum in the last 10 years has been fueled by theories, sort of an emerging focus on decolonization, decolonialism, and the efforts of Indigenous peoples to really to find their way back to restore their own cultural community, and seeing these cultural heritage artifacts as crucial to doing that, to try to find what has been lost and taken. So you're sort of putting that out there as a sort of larger framework or picture of the discussion. I want to tell you first just a little bit about the Peace Resource Center. We might go into it in greater depth along the way. But has anybody heard of the Peace Resource Center before today's talk? You know, I guess I can't see the whole gallery. I see people's hands, but so the Peace Resource Center at Wilmington College, it was established in 1975 by a woman named Barbara Reynolds. She was a convinced Quaker, meaning that she converted to Quakerism rather than being born into Quakerism. So she was a convinced Quaker, and she was a nuclear abolitionist. And her story is rich and complicated, and hope to go into a little bit of it along the way. But she came to establish that center at Wilmington College because Wilmington College is a Quaker college. It's in Southwest Ohio, a very rural part of the United States, very out of the way. It's a very surprising place to find this kind of global center that's dedicated to peace. The center itself is very humble. We're in a 2-story Victorian wood frame Victorian home. The collection itself is not incredibly large. It's probably about 300 linear feet. But yet, in spite of its size and its sort of humble stature, it is considered the largest collection in the United States of materials related to the human experience of nuclear war through the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And certainly, you know, the United States National Archives, the University of Chicago archives regarding the Manhattan Project. There's all kinds of archives that are you know, vastly warehouses full of materials. So we're not making that claim, but in terms of sort of understanding, having materials about those who were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the time, and then the nuclear disarmament movement that emerged out of the atomic bombing sufferers and their activism were really the center in the United States. And we're the only academic center in the United States that is wholly devoted to the atomic bombings, of understanding the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki from that perspective. So, so that's another sort of piece as I move forward through this talk for you to have in the background. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that might be good for you to know about the Peace Resource Center at this time. We're constantly sort of programming related to nuclear disarmament and the history of the atomic bombings. And we have scholars reaching out to us all year round and visiting us before COVID. COVID has really shifted the nature of our work in terms of scholarly research and researchers. So we're trying to understand that transformation and making sure that we can connect and work with scholars as effectively as we had before. So anyway, we can talk about some of those changes also in the Q&A period. So let me move on here. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts before I move into sort of the body of the talk? All right, so we'll move on ahead here. So we're gonna move in here. And first of all, this talk is about a cross, a wooden cross that survived the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, and in particular, the atomic bombing of the Urakami Cathedral in Nagasaki, Japan. And I'm wondering, I'm just going to stop this share for a second because I want to see you. But how many of you here in the gallery are familiar with the history of the Urakami community in Nagasaki? Just like to have a show of hands. Sort of, kind of, sort of. Okay, and I'm not sure the people who are off screen I'm seeing maybe not so much. So sort of, I see from Elizabeth, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'll go into that just a little bit because I think it's a very important part of this story. So, and I don't need the PowerPoint to do that. So the Urakami Cathedral in Nagasaki is the word Urakami is reference to the Urakami Valley in Nagasaki, in the city of Nagasaki. And within the Urakami Valley, they're developed in the 15th and 16th, well, more in the 16th century, a community of Catholic Christians, often referred to as Kakure Christians. You may have heard that term before. And many of you are aware that in the 16th century, Jesuits from Portugal and Spain started traveling to Japan. They started missionary work in Nagasaki, Japan, and gradually sort of converted, several thousands of Christians to Catholicism. And that at the same time, over a century or so. And many of those Christians were in the Urakami area of Nagasaki. In addition to that, during the 16th century, Buddhism was developing a number of sort of radical, meaning sort of very, very passionate followers connected, much more evangelical kind of sects that were much more active than they had been before. And when the Tokugawa government came into control, they were very anxious. Not only our kind of common understanding of this story is that it's a East-West conflict and that the sort of Japan is trying to get rid of the Christians, but I think a little bit more broader understanding of that situation is that the Tokugawa government has come into control about 1602 or 1603, and is very uneasy about its political stability. It is very anxious about any sort of upstarts or any kind of rebellions that might decenter its power. So in the 1600s through 1637 is the Shimabara rebellion of Christians, converted Christians in the southern part of Japan. And eventually by the mid-17th century, the Tokugawa state government, early modern government, cracks down on the Christians, the Catholic Christians, but also on these Buddhist sects who it feels have just become too radicalized and are too threatening to political control. So by the end of the 17th century, these Christian Catholics have largely gone underground. Some of you know the story by Endo Shusaku Silence, right? And it's become a movie. So then some people are even more familiar with this. But by the end of the 17th century, these Christians have gone into hiding and are worshiping in secret for the next several hundred years and keeping sort of their own cult. That some of this emerges to become their own culturally unique religious practice. Some of it stays very much tied to Catholicism. And then in 1868, when during the Meiji Revolution, when the Tokugawa government grassroots plus sort of folks who are concerned about Japan's sovereignty amidst colonialism overthrow the Tokugawa government, then in the next 20 years or 10 years, decade or so, those Urakami Christians come out of hiding and start to sort of worship again publicly and develop ties and connections to the Catholic Church. It's a very poor community at that time. And in terms of sort of Neo-Confucianism at the end of the 19th century, again, sort of religious groups that are not in line with the policy of Fukoku Kyohei or rich country, strong military, who are not sort of following the increasingly centralized control, are shunned and ostracized. And then Christianity also, the kind of the uncertainty of a Christian faith in a community is leading to discrimination. But yeah, go ahead. Did I hear a question out there? Okay. Anyway, feel free to chime in. So this community is quite poor, but they start to work on building a cathedral in Nagasaki during the last 20 years of the 19th century. And sort of stories that they tell are that, you know, sort of the workers, the industrial workers, or the really poor community, they sell one rag at a time and get, you know, just a few sen here, a few sen there. And gradually over the next 40 years, they build up this very, very large brick cathedral, and it becomes the largest cathedral in East Asia. And they finished the cathedral in 1939 after, you know, 40, 50 years of building it brick by brick. And they build it on the site where the persecutions took place and by the Tokugawa government. So they're right in that exact same spot. So then in 1939, the cathedral is completed. Japan is heading into war with the United States. Japan has been occupying parts of, okay, I'm not going to go into that, but Japan is well into the Pacific War, an imminent war with the United States. And then in 1945, when the United States detonates an atomic bomb, it detonates in Nagasaki, it detonates it over the Urakami Valley. And 8,000 of the 11,000 Catholics who are living there are killed in the atomic bombing. Oh. So I think that's really an important piece for us to know about this story. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why did the USA decide to bomb Nagasaki, knowing that there were many Christians living there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Nagasaki was really considered to be, there's still not historical consensus as to why Nagasaki made it onto the list of target cities. It seems to be shoved on the list sort of at the last moment. People aren't exactly sure. And some of you may realize or may know, or may not know, that the United States intended to bomb a different city that day, Kokura. But because the weather was bad, the pilots couldn't see their target. And it was mandated that they must be able to see the target before they released the atomic bomb. So they headed south to Nagasaki. And they almost didn't bomb Nagasaki that day. They were about to head back with the atomic bomb still undetonated when the clouds opened up and they were able to see the target. So they released the bomb. So I'm sorry, I don't have a satisfactory answer to that. There was a naval base there that the United States saw as, you know, a strategic point for invasion and occupation. But yeah, it's not clear how Nagasaki got on that list.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back here to the PowerPoint and so in 1982, a US veteran of World War II by the name of Walter G. Hook donated the atomic bombed cross to the Peace Resource Center at Wilmington College. We're not sure why he did that. We did learn as we researched the cross and sort of went and dug into the records that he and the PRC founder, Barbara Reynolds, they were both active in anti-nuclear activism in the late 70s and 1980s. And they were both in upstate New York in 1980 at some conference. And so we don't have any documentation about it, but we know she was there. And then later we found out he was there. So we speculate they met amidst their work on nuclear disarmament activism. And Walter must have told her about the cross that he had displayed so prominently in his home for more than 1945, so 40, almost 40 years. And she must have told him about the Peace Resource Center. And from there, we have some documentation. So Walter then donated, he drove with his wife, Carolyn, and they donated the cross to the Peace Resource Center in 1982. So we have some memos back and forth between Walter and the then director, Helen Redding, about the donation of the cross. But not a lot of context why he decided to do that. He died in 2010 at the age of 97, so he would have been in his early 70s at that time. So maybe he was thinking about sort of retirement and trying to, I'm just not sure. Let's see, this is not cooperating right now. Let's see if I can get it to the next page. There we go. All right, so I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about Barbara Reynolds here. Barbara Reynolds was a nuclear abolitionist. As I mentioned, she was a Quaker, active from about 1950 to 1990. And she was married to Earl Reynolds, who became a scientist with the Atomic Bombing Casualty Commission in Hiroshima. And he was there from 1947 to 1954. They were from Yellow Springs, Ohio, which is actually the village that I'm talking to you from right now. So that was, it's kind of an odd coincidence. But Earl Reynolds was a professor of physical anthropology at Antioch College, and he specifically specialized in children's growth and maturation and understanding the relationship between the environment and the sort of physiological growth and maturation of children. So the United States government called him to go to Hiroshima in 1947, to about 2 years after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, and Barbara and their 3 children traveled with him. And in 1954, he submitted his report. It was a 3-year study of children who had survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. He purportedly discovered strontium-90, an isotope, a radioactive isotope that impacts the thyroid. And so that becomes some of the testing that people do, for example, on children in Fukushima, to understand the levels of radioactivity in the thyroid and its possible impact. In 1954, he submitted his 3-year study to the United States, the ABCC, Atomic Bombing Casualty Commission. They sent that back to the United States Atomic Energy Commission, and it was censored for about a decade. So nobody saw that report. Earl Reynolds, after he finished his report, took a break or a sabbatical and decided to sail around the world. He worked with a Japanese shipbuilder in Hiroshima. They crafted a 50-foot yacht called the Phoenix of Hiroshima. And he and Barbara and 2 of their children, one son went back to the States for college, but he and 2 of their children, along with 3 Japanese atomic bombing sufferers, traveled out in that yacht for 4 years. They traveled around, they circumnavigated the globe, they traveled around the world, and they traveled about 58,000 nautical miles. And what they found as they stopped at the ports was that people were fascinated with the Japanese atomic bombing sufferers and the name of the yacht, Phoenix of Hiroshima. And it was through the stories of the Japanese atomic bombing sufferers that the Reynolds family finally learned the true sort of implications of the atomic bombings, and they became politicized as a result of that. And so by the end of their voyage in 1958, they arrived in Honolulu and they met. And this was also a time when the United States was rapidly increasing its nuclear testing in the Pacific and the Marshall Islands. So 5 tests in 1954 to 75 tests in 1958. And when they arrived in Honolulu in 1958, they found that there was another yacht called the Golden Rule, which was led by a group of Quakers who was protesting U.S. nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. And the crew of that yacht had just been arrested by the United States government for attempting to sail into a test site in protest. And so the Reynolds family then decided that they would take their place and sail into the test site. And so they managed to sail into the test site. It was a hard tack series of atomic bombing tests. And they made it in about 60 miles and they too were arrested. And so they were forced to sail back, and Earl was on trial for about 2 years under house arrest, was finally released because the United States had no constitutional grounds to arrest him. And after that, they went back to they went back to Hiroshima, Japan, where Earl taught at Hiroshima City University. No, he did not. He taught at Hiroshima Jogakuin Daigaku. So he was at Hiroshima Jogakuin, and Barbara Reynolds continued her activism, nuclear disarmament activism. In 1962 and 1964, she led 2 delegations of hibakusha to travel around the world to every nuclear weapons holding country, which at that time was the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and why am I missing one? Because China's not in on it yet. So it's largely those 4 countries. And those delegations broke her bank. It caused, conflict in her family. She and Earl divorced at that time. And then in 1965, she founded the World Friendship Center with Tomin Harada in Hiroshima. He was a physician, a very famous physician, atomic bombing sufferer in Hiroshima. And they founded that center in 1965 as a space where atomic bombing sufferers could tell their stories to members of the international community who were visiting Hiroshima. At the end of the 1960s, the Japanese nuclear disarmament activists increasingly were not interested in having a white woman as their figurehead. They saw the need to be their own representatives and be their own voices, quite understandably. And they probably saw the need long before that, but it was probably at the end of the 1960s that Barbara Reynolds recognized that was an issue. And so she returned to the United States, this time to create awareness in the US about the atomic bombings. She founded the Peace Resource Center in Wilmington College in 1975 through her Quaker connections. And then the center has been in place then for the last 45 years, 40, maybe a little more than that. So does anybody have any questions about that piece before I move on? Okay, great. Okay. So as I mentioned, Barbara Reynolds and Earl Reynolds met somewhere in upstate New York. Walter G. Hook is fascinating. He's a fascinating human being, and for a lot of reasons, because he doesn't fit in sort of our common sort of categories, perhaps, of what we think as military and civilian. Or in my case, I was brought up Catholic, and he doesn't sort of fit with my understanding of Catholics. So there's a lot of places where he can't easily be confined within categories. But you can see here that he was graduated Loyola High School in New York City. He was the son of a very, very devoted Catholic family. Loyola, of course, was administered and taught by Jesuits. He was an ardent, in the 1920s, was an ardent follower of the Catholic worker movement, and particularly of activist Dorothy Day, who was, is still very radical, an anarchist, a socialist, and also remained a Catholic for her entire life. He moved into a career in labor relations in the 30s. And then in 1942, he enlisted in the military. He was in his early 30s. He did not need to enlist, but he felt convinced that he needed to support the United States in its war against Japan, war with Japan. After he came back in 1945, he resumed his career in labor relations and joined UPS, and he became charged with the integration of UPS, and he became very involved in the civil rights movement, pushed hard for complete integration within UPS, and so was very active in racial equality in that time period. He eventually became the vice president of UPS in the 1980s. And then when he retired, he became very active in the National Association. Well, he was active, but put his energy fully into the National Association of Radiation Survivors. So that's just a little bit about his background. So in 1945, Walter G. Hook was sent in to Sasebo as part of the US occupation forces. He was initially sent all around the Japanese coast to collect weapons that would have been used against United States soldiers if an invasion had taken place. So going into caves, and he said there was never any issues. He always felt safe in his work, and there was never any resistance involved as he went around these coastlines getting weapons. In the fall of 1945 and early October, he and other troops moved into Nagasaki. And he, just by a sheer sort of mix-up, ended up becoming a Jeep driver in Nagasaki, which he loved because nobody kept track of him and he could drive around the city from morning till night in the Jeep. And so he sort of wandered the city, and we have oral interviews with him that are quite fascinating. He sort of talks about the horror of Nagasaki, and that, that it was still very evident, the sort of physical destruction of human lives, and that it took him a really long time to talk about it once he returned. So he was stationed in Nagasaki. In January of 1946, he met Bishop Aijiro Yamaguchi, or Paul Yamaguchi. And Aijiro Yamaguchi, by that time he was Archbishop, but he was a Catholic. He was a nationalist Catholic. So going into, as Japan expanded its empire and he invaded Manchuria and then into China, Aijiro Yamaguchi supported the war. Still, however, the Japanese government was very suspicious of the Catholics. Some of them were sent to camps. Aijiro Yamaguchi was sent to the Flores Islands, where he became the colonial administrator of the Flores Islands. And during the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, he lost his family in the bombings. And when he came back in 1945, he resumed his role at that time and became Archbishop of the Urakami Cathedral. He and Walter met. Walter apparently was assigned to him to be his driver around the city of Nagasaki. As they drove around the city of Nagasaki, they met folks such as Takashi Nagai, or Nagai Takashi, who's the sort of most famously talked about Nagasaki as a sacrifice, as a kind of sacrifice, a necessary suffering in terms of Christian framing. So, but during that time, he was also going through the rubble of the Urakami Cathedral and cleaning up. We have oral interviews where he said he was trying to recover every single thing he could find. And it appears that it was mostly not so much out of a desire to pillage and steal, which many American soldiers did, without a doubt. In this case, it seemed to be more faith-driven, that he was trying to sort of recover things so that he could give them back to the bishop. And so during that time, he apparently found this cross that I showed you in the beginning among the rubble. So you can see here, later we found, later when we were verifying the authenticity of the cross with the Urakami Diocese, they found pictures in their archives. You can see this is Asahi Shimbun. It was a photo taken sometime and likely in January 1946 of the cross in the rubble. And here the Archbishop Mitsuaki Takami found a picture in where the cross is located at the top of the altar. So it was confusing for folks to see this cross because it's not as ornate as sort of typical Catholic crosses are. And so there was some confusion about whether this was really a Catholic cross at first. And so we had to do some digging to find that. And then it appears that once Walter Hooke found this cross and gave it to the bishop, we don't really have any documentation about that. We don't know why the bishop gave it to him. We just have no knowledge of this. Walter didn't discuss the exact reasons for it. We just don't know. His family and sort of the story is that it's out of their friendship, but we would like to know more. It is clear, because there was a question, did Walter Hooke just steal the cross and take it back? But we do have lots of documentation of their friendship. You can see this letter is from 1947. Bishop Yamaguchi also visited Walter G. Hooke at his home in the 50s and then in the 60s, where the cross was displayed. So it's highly unlikely that this was theft, a cultural heritage theft from, in that sense, in the true sense, from Nagasaki. And here we have one of the members of the Urakami Diocese Committee verifying the cross and verifying that it's the same one that we held in our center. So we wonder why Bishop Yamaguchi would have given him the cross. Friendship is certainly a motivation, but you would think was a very valuable artifact, that there might be more in play. In Nagasaki at the time, there was a debate about what to do with the ruins of the Urakami Cathedral. So many people in Hiroshima, of course, recognized the atomic bombed dome, Genbaku Dome. Right? But in Nagasaki, the conversation was, should we keep the ruins of the cathedral as a memorial, or should we rebuild this cathedral anew? And Archbishop Yamaguchi was on the side of wanting to rebuild the Urakami Cathedral. He said that the cathedral should be a living church, not a church of sort of remembering the dead. And And so in the 1950s, he toured the United States and received many donations from powerful individuals to rebuild the cathedral. Aijiro Yamaguchi was apparently close with some of the military leadership and some of the political leadership in the United States. And there certainly was the sense that they would rather get rid of the rubble of a Christian Catholic cathedral that the United States had bombed rather than leaving it as a memorial. So we think that there were some political, and not just we think, there are scholars who write about this, such as Tomoe Otsuki. There's some other Japanese scholars who have sort of followed this research and sort of made these arguments. So probably in terms of the cross, Bishop Yamaguchi was not too concerned about giving away that artifact, believing that he would rebuild the Urakami Cathedral. Apparently bricks from the Urakami Cathedral were sent to Sasebo to build, or other parts of Nagasaki to build churches. Another Japanese, I can't remember if he was a journalist. I meant to look into this before we talked this evening, but another Japanese individual took the atomic bombed Hibaku Maria, which is a very famous artifact, and took that up north, took it from the rubble and took it up north to Hokkaido for a while, and held on to it for several decades before it was discovered and recovered and brought back to the church. So we have some of those artifacts also in Japan. And so what you're seeing here are the rubble of the cathedral and then the rebuilt cathedral.
Wow.
So, and this again is I've sort of mentioned that Walter Hoek was involved in civil rights and labor relations in the 60s and 70s. Walter Hoek took the cross back to the United States on a ship. His mother put it in the closet because she was afraid of contamination, radiation and contamination. When he got back, he displayed the cross proudly in his family's living room. His children told me that they often grew tired of the cross, and certainly his mother did too, that every time they moved to a new house, as he moved about the States with his work, he would have to put that old cross up on the wall and they'd have to look at it. But he did care for it and display it prominently in his house and told the story of Nagasaki to his family. Now there's one more piece here that's fascinating. So Walter G. Hoek's niece, who recently passed away, Sister Megan Rice, was also a devoted Catholic, became a Catholic nun. She lived in parts of Africa for some years, and then came back to the States and became involved with the Society of Jesus, which is a fairly radical Catholic order. And in 2012, she was arrested for infiltrating the Y-12 National Security Complex at Oak Ridge with 2 other priests. And if you know anything about this, the United States, it is the most secured site in the United States. It's where plutonium is stored in the United States. And Congress has paid billions of dollars to secure this site. And basically these 3 walked in with a metal clipper, a bolt cutter. They walked in with a bolt cutter, cut through the chain link fence and made it up to the plutonium storage site and started to paint it with blood, which is sort of the Catholic way of talking about the suffering of Jesus and the suffering of war and advocating for peace. So she was jailed for about 2 years and was finally released from prison in 2014. And as part of learning about this cross, I was able to have a conversation with her in 2019. And she was still very lively and clear at that point. So it's interesting to think about sort of the legacies of activism within this family. Walter Hook joined the Association of Atomic Veterans and was very instrumental in getting Congress to recognize the impact of radiation exposure on atomic veterans, not only with soldiers who were sent into Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but all of the soldiers who were exposed to radiation during US nuclear testing. And so he was instrumental in getting the Radiation Exposed Veterans Compensation Act passed in Congress in 1988. So maybe this is something we can talk about after the break. I know I've been talking for quite a while here, but there are some competing narratives about this cross. And also, I haven't really told you about how and why we came to return the cross. So that might be something we can talk about after we get back. But various sort of constituents or stakeholders tell different stories about the Urakami Cathedral, about the cross, and these result in sort of having different understandings of this artifact and what it means. And I think that tension is a good thing. And so we could explore that a bit further after. All right. So is that okay to stop here for a break, or are we too early? I'm happy to go on for a little bit longer if it's better to go on. So either way.
I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
That the national the organization in United States, National Radiation, what was it?
Of atomic,
atomic, yeah. Does that organization also include the victims, the Native American victims living around was it Alamo? The experiment site. I visited that museum and I read about the article that many Native Americans living around that area were affected by the radiation.
Yeah, I mean, they were mining uranium. A lot of, I think it's Lakota, but I also should confirm, but they were mining radiation for the Manhattan Project. Barbara, yeah.
I think it was Navajo.
Navajo, yep, you're right. I'm sorry. I don't know why I had Lakota in my head. Thank you. Yeah, so they were mining uranium and they were not aware of the dangers whatsoever. And then amidst the Trinity test too, there were all kinds of Native American, people living in that area along with ranchers, and they were exposed to radiation at that time too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it does not include them because it's the veterans. It's intended to be a compensation act for veterans. It's a good question. I don't know if there's something else out there. I don't think so. There is a very active organization called, it's the Trinity Test Downwinders. I'll look it up during the break, but there's a Downwinders organization for the Trinity Test that is trying to, get compensation for exposure to radiation, and they are working with Indigenous groups.
I see.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay, well, if you'd like, we could take a quick 10-minute break here and come back and then have Kenya finish with the return of the cross and then go into our Q&A. So why don't we pause here, 10-minute break. You can stay logged in, but you can mute yourselves and turn off your video. And we will come back at 10:05 Japan time. And I'm not sure what time it is where you are in the States if you're joining us from America or other places. So see you back here in 10 minutes to finish the rest of this talk. Thank you so much.
Sounds great. Thank you, everybody.
All right, so welcome back to the second part of the talk. I think we'll hear a little bit more from Tanya, Dr. Mouse, and then go into a question answer discussion period. So if you'd like to begin the second part, please start.
Well, thank you so much for coming back. I know Zoom can be long, and being on a screen isn't always ideal. So I just wanted to talk briefly, maybe less than 10 minutes, about how the repatriation came about. And then we can move into a longer discussion where, I hope we can all have a conversation together. So the repatriation of this cross, I started at the Peace Research Center in 2015, and the cross was on the wall. And I'm formally trained in the late 19th century, early 20th century Japanese history. But for a lot of reasons, I started teaching about the atomic bombings as a professor, and then shifted over to the work at the Peace Resource Center in 2015. And so I saw the cross there. I thought it was amazing. But also the center had so many needs at the time. It was in complete disarray. The collection had been almost completely forgotten. No one at the institution knew anything about Japan, let alone how to read or speak Japanese. And so it took several years, 3-4 years, before I gave it much thought other than as being this amazing artifact. But what happened is Japanese visitors would come in, and there were a couple of visitors that really made an impact. One was a famous pianist in Japan by the name of Keiko Fujie. And she's a classical pianist, but she's also an experimental composer. And she was in Yellow Springs doing a performance of her opera called A Performance About Nagasaki. The title just left my mind. It was a beautiful opera. And so she came up to the Peace Research Center, and her husband's family is from Nagasaki. And when she saw the cross, she just gasped and had such a strong sort of visceral reaction to it. And so that was one visit where I thought I really need to start thinking about this cross and its meaning and why we have it. And then the other visitors were a film crew, NHK film crew from Nagasaki, who was on campus filming a documentary about Susan Southard, who wrote a very famous book called Nagasaki Life After Nuclear War, but also about the Peace Resource Center and the students on our campus. So they saw the cross, and they didn't believe me when I said it was a gift. They for certain thought that Walter Hook had pillaged and taken the cross. And so that also these two pieces became a site of sort of curiosity, of consternation, curiosity, a need to explore further. And then I was working with an amazing undergraduate student named Michaela. And Michaela was very passionate about NAGPRA. She's the first person, as I said, as a 19th century historian of Japan. And I was concerned about sort of indigenous people's issues in the United States, but not very aware. And she started talking about NAGPRA quite a bit. And then I started hearing about NAGPRA, and then looking at this cross every day and thinking, like, why do we have this cross, and should we even have it? And so from there, I talked with a colleague in Chicago, Dr. Yuki Miyamoto, who's a scholar of the ethics of nuclear war. And she put me in touch with another scholar at Northwestern University, Dr. Hirokazu Miyazaki. And from there, we started to reach out to the Nagasaki, the Urakami Diocese in Nagasaki. And there's so much more to that, but it's pretty detailed. So, and then from there, they had not realized that that cross existed. So they had forgotten about it. It had been lost in memory. And so it took a while for them to sort of realize what it was, and again, to verify its authenticity. And then we had thought about taking it on the 75th anniversary, taking it back on the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings, but I felt like that would be in the way. Like, I didn't want that to be a distraction for the real purpose of those commemorations. So then we decided to take it in the fall of 2019 on the commemoration. So, and then we ended up taking it across the Pacific Ocean in a bass guitar case. And, you know, we formally repatriated it to the diocese on at their August 9 commemoration mass. And it was just an amazing experience. I'll show you just a few images of that experience, and then I think we can talk a little bit. So let's see here. And it really surprised me the way this story took hold. I mean, the one thing about August 6 and 9 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that journalists are always looking for something new, because there's so many things that have been covered over the years. And so it's very exciting when there's a new story. So that might be one of the reasons why it took hold. And then just sort of the mystery of it, and the forgetting and the remembering, it just was very, it became quite a sensation that summer. So we're going to skip over this. There was a whole doll component to this trip in Nagasaki, which is a whole other history of the US-Japan doll exchange. But you can ask me later if you want to know more. This was a press conference with Archbishop Mitsuaki Takami, then Archbishop. He's retired since, and then an atomic prominent parishioner, an atomic bombing sufferer, and his name is not, I have it somewhere, his name's not coming to mind. And then sort of me looking out at all those journalists going, what the heck is going on here? So, and the commemoration mass with the atomic bombed, the cross was the Archbishop sort of saw the cross as a reunification of Mary and Jesus. So the cross was repatriated. In the commemoration mass, the atomic bombed Mary is always sort of brought down the aisle. And so the cross followed the atomic bombed Maria down the aisle. Go back here. And this is my dear colleague. She is the Quaker minister of Wilmington College. She traveled with me along with 3 students. And so, oh, the cross went before. I had forgotten. Okay, the cross came before the atomic bombed Maria. Well, that's kind of sad in my mind, but anyhow, there she is repatriating the cross. And then in November of that year, in 2019, the Pope Francis visited the Urakami Cathedral. And so they had the cross out there for his visit. So I don't know how much of the story they told him, but people sent me pictures of this. All right.
All right. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I'm sure we have lots of questions, so I'd just like to go ahead and immediately open the floor to discussion and questions. I know we already had some comments in the chat, but feel free to go ahead and chime in with more questions, comments, anything you have. I wonder if you could speak a little more. You mentioned they had the cross out for the Pope's visit, but is the cross like on permanent display? Is it back part of the I don't know what they're called. You showed us a picture of it, the altar. Is it back part of like the altar in Nagasaki? Like what's its place in the cathedral now? Do you know?
Yes, so in the Urakami Cathedral, there is a chapel on the right side of the cathedral when you walk toward the altar. And that is where the atomic bomb Maria has been displayed. And so they created a place to display the cross next to her in that chapel.
So there's
Yeah, so it's on permanent display there.
okay. So if you go to the cathedral, you'll be able to see it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then apparently people were asking for, to see, other Catholic organizations were asking to see the cross. So they had an exact replica made that they could send to other organizations. So they could send it around.
That's kind of fascinating. Like, is it interest in like the history of it or the repatriation of it? Like, what is it? Other Catholic organizations in Japan or globally?
Yeah, other Catholic organizations in Japan who want to see it. I'm not sure the reasons why they want to see it. I mean, I think it's considered to be something miraculous that it survived the atomic bombing in the first place. We're not sure why it survived because it's wood. But speculation, it had been taken down before the atomic bombings and replaced with a metal cross at the top of the altar. So probably it was stored in a closet somewhere, and that's why it was not destroyed when the cathedral was bombed. So,
Amazing. So
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
All right. We have a question in the chat now.
Yeah.
Dr. Suzuki says, thank you for this fascinating talk. Did you get a sense of how the parishioners or Nagasaki residents responded to the return of the cross?
Yeah, we only heard a few voices. They were sort of parishioners that were close to the church leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they, were moved and excited and thrilled to have, and you saw sort of the faces in that photograph. There was a sense of wonder that this cross was coming back home. But I had heard some of the parishioners were feeling some discontent, but I can't quite remember why. And I have to talk to my colleague, Dr. Miyazaki, because he sort of shared some of this with me. I think maybe some of the spectacle was concerning to them, and that it's not about this sort of, again, these sort of Americans who are bringing back this cross, like that's not where our focus should be, kind of thing. But I'm not quite sure. I need to clarify that a little bit more.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension about relics from the atomic bombing. And they can be things like the Urakami cross, or even things like, I know that we've talked before about body parts, things like that, that the United States kept to study. So there's a lot of contention about these objects, and how does like the Urakami cross fit into like these larger dialogues? Because yours is one of the few cases, I don't want to call it successful repatriation, but it didn't seem as contentious, right? It was widely covered in the Japanese media, and like you're saying, it was kind of like a celebratory story, like a homecoming. And I wonder, how you would situate it within like these broader dialogues and some of the other issues that have come up around artifacts from the bombing and who they belong to and where they belong.
Yeah, so I think the reason that this was perceived as such, a sort of such a miracle, in quotes, I guess, is that in a lot of cases of the repatriation, people have had to request the repatriation. They've had to sue, they've at minimum had to say to make a request, or they've had to sue or something. So in our case, we kind of just came out of the woodwork from nowhere and said, we have this artifact and we want you to have it back. And so I think that's maybe the reason why it was viewed so favorably within Japan. I'm sure people were like, well, why did this, like I said, like the NHK crew were like, why did he have it in the first place? And sure, he said they were friends, but probably he just took it. So, yeah. And those feelings are understandable.
Yeah, so another follow-up question then from Dr. Suzuki that says, this is so complex. Thank you for presenting such a nuanced view. Would you also be able to speak to the significance of the cross coming before Maria? Was it because the Maria had been part of the cathedral's procession in the past? You did mention you're uncomfortable with this, so can we dig into that a little bit?
Well, what do you all think? I mean, what do you think when you see the cross coming before, the atomic bombed Maria? Any thoughts about that? We can look at that picture. We can look at that image again.
You said they've used the Maria in processionals before, right?
Yeah, it's an annual procession of yeah.
Has the cross been incorporated into the other annual processions that use the Maria, or was this like a one-time thing?
Yeah, I mean, do they process with the cross now?
Yeah, because if they only use the Maria in the annual events and don't use the cross, then it might make sense for the cross to go first because it's a one-time thing. Yeah, is there any meaning to it? Could it have just been that it was the new thing from Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, so that's one read, is that it's the thing that has been returned. So, of course it goes first. But now reading this image after a couple of years, we have my colleague who is a white woman, standing in front, walking ahead, and then the atomic bombing sufferer carrying the atomic bombed Maria. To me, it's a really complicated image to read. And in some sense, I think there's a patriarchal sense that this is Jesus now. Jesus is back. So we have a man back in charge. And this is the proper order of things. And that's nothing to do with Japan. I mean, that's Catholicism. That's the Catholic Church. Our church many times said, it's the return, it's a reunification of Jesus and Mary. And if you're a Marianist, Mary is an incredibly important, she's the giver of life. She's the source of miracles. She's a goddess.
Yeah.
So in Catholicism, does Mary come before Jesus Christ? I'm a Shinkyoto, I'm a Protestant. So, it's a surprise for me to hear that, Mary comes before Jesus. Is that what Catholics believe, that Mary comes before Jesus?
Well, I think there's a wide range of beliefs. But what I think of when you ask that question is my grandma was she was an extremely devout Catholic, rosaries 3 times a day, all the fasting, all the holy days. And she must have had 6 or 7 albums just full of sightings of Mary and Mary's miracles. And so I think there are currents. And then there's places like Lourdes where Mary, supposedly heals people, and Fatima where Mary heals people. And so there is sort of currents in Catholicism that elevate Mary as, you know, an extraordinary, almost like a deity, almost like a goddess in her own right. So, but, you know, it's not necessarily the norm. Also in our community, the University of Dayton is one of, I think, 2 or 3 Marianist colleges in the United States, and the Marianists, you know, they're sort of devoted to the Virgin Mary, sort of see her as a unique, as the, you know, one of the most unique, powerful sources in Catholicism. So, yeah. Barbara, I saw you up there with your hand.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it's probably reading too much in it to think of it as a kind of patriarchal thing, or which figure is more important. They were equal in the sense that both of them were atomic bombed. So,
Yeah.
and I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly which one was repatriated first. Was that Mary that went back first?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So in a
Yeah.
sense, the cross was the newer item, and it
Yes,
might
yes.
just have been that it was newer, and therefore, and also as Kyoko said, I think Jesus is in a way a more important figure than Mary, although as you said, it depends partly on the group.
Yeah.
My grandmother was a very devout Catholic as well. I don't remember her so much with the rosaries though, but yeah, so I don't know. I think that's reading a little too much into it.
Mm.
Okay, Elizabeth has her hand up too.
That maybe you don't have the answer, but I wonder why that lady walked down the aisle with the cross. For example, another way that it could have been done would have been that she would have handed it to a Nagasaki person, and then that person would walk down the aisle with it.
Mhm.
But it's not really a question, it's just, yeah, it's an observation, but.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is because that's what they told us to do. You know, that's sort of how they envisioned it, is that we would bring it down the aisle and then give it to them. They asked me to do that, and I'm no longer Catholic, and I said I can't carry a cross down an aisle. So, and I'm not Christian either. I mean, I'm just not religious. So I said I don't feel comfortable doing that. And so then I asked our campus minister, would you please do that? And so then she took that role. So that's how that came about. But I think your question, you know, your larger question is, you know, if we had thought that through, you know, given how visible that image is, and that's kind of become an iconic image, that could have been a more suitable way to do it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have a question about how your Peace Resource Center handles this history of the Urakami Cross, and obviously it's not on display anymore, but surely you must talk about the history, and obviously you have archives related to the repatriation, but how do you share this event or display the history of your role in this to your visitors?
I talk about it in my classes with my students. There's not really a communal memory of this event on our campus, but I do talk about it in my atomic bombing classes. Just sort of thinking about legacies of war and colonialism. I mean, the piece I haven't mentioned yet is that we were contacted by the diocese in mid-August, and they told us that they planned to visit us on September 30. They had a second replica of the cross made. And so they are bringing that to us. There's a delegation of 6 people coming to Wilmington College on September 30 to bring us that replica. So it's a really wonderful thing for them to do, and that will help that sort of memory stay visible on our campus. Apparently the replica is so exact that you can't tell them apart.
That's kind of amazing. I have more questions about that, but Donna has a question now too. So Professor Fujimoto, would you like to ask? Sure.
Catherine, if yours is on the same, because I'm going to change the topic. So why don't you?
That's
continue
okay.
with your-
That's okay. Go ahead. That's okay.
Okay. Well, actually, I'm quite interested in, you had the, Tanya, you had that list of competing narratives. And I
Mhm.
think bring that up because I'm really interested in
Yeah.
what were the viewpoints. Because I'm not, I don't know what they might be. So I was interested in learning more about them.
Yeah, you know, I haven't looked. I made this presentation, like I said, I haven't revisited it for a while. I'm trying to see if I can get the PowerPoint to move here. Let's see, let's go back. Do I have it there, or let's go back here a little bit. There's a lot involved in this trip. It was the trip of a lifetime. It was very epic. Let's see here. So the Hook family, do you have questions about those? Because I don't need to start talking again. I would love to hear your thoughts or questions.
No, I just kind of, there was quite a list. So
Yeah.
I would like you just go ahead and go down the list and maybe people can ask questions about more.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, Archbishop Takami Mitsuaki, he retired last year, I think. He really took the opportunity of the repatriation of this cross in the commemorative mass. He spent quite a bit of time talking about Japanese imperialism and Japanese atrocities in East Asia, which was surprising to me, and I think surprising to many. Dr. Miyazaki at Northwestern sort of looked at some of the previous lectures from, like, I don't know, from the 1950s or something like that, and said that that was a very unique moment in terms of the commemorative masses. Sermons is the proper word. But he also took me aside and said that, you know, this reminds us that what happened on August 9, 1945 was the killing of Christians. So again, there's a sort of sense that this makes, again, it makes visible the use of nuclear weapons on Catholics in Japan. For me, that really exceptionalizes one group of people over another, but you know, in terms of identity and given the history of the church and the persecution from the 16th century, it makes sense to me. In terms of the city of Nagasaki, we met with the mayor, we met with all of the, like the head of the A-bomb museum. You know, there were, all of the mass media was there. And my sense from the reports that came out, and again, I'm trying to write an article about this. I have been for a while, so it's good for me to sort of talk this out. I appreciate your question, Donna. It's really the sense that you know, Nagasaki has a place in this history. I think whenever there's, you know, high visibility about Nagasaki, there's a sense, and that, you know, Hiroshima is typically sort of the focal point. And so I think there is a sense that this is welcomed, that the repatriation is welcomed, and again highlights the fact that Nagasaki too, suffered so much loss and damage from the United States. And Nagasaki, of course, is much more controversial because most scholars now, except for maybe right-wing extremists, would agree that there was no reason to actually use an atomic weapon on Nagasaki. They might still talk about Hiroshima as a matter of trying to explore to what extent it was a military necessity, but there's not a question about Nagasaki at this point. NHK World and NHK Nagasaki sort of just continue to put out these documentaries where these are sort of pretty contemporary, feel-good sort of affirmations of the goodness of people and, and hopes for world peace. So I didn't see any, any shifts there in their coverage of it. Asahi News, there's a reporter there by the name of Tainaka Masato. He's much more sort of nuanced in his perspectives and much more critical of the Catholic Church. And so some of his reporting included a little bit of that. And one thing he shared with me is that he is not allowed to say the US dropped an atomic bomb on Japan. He's not able to make the United States the actor of that in any of his reporting. I don't know if that's changed, but at the time that was the case. So when he writes a story, even in Asahi News, he has to say the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. And the Peace Resource Center at Wilmington College, what I feel working at that center is the constant need to make us visible. And so sometimes the repatriation of that cross got caught up in that desperation to make us matter and make us visible and make us, we're always at the mercy of the college in terms of our budget or getting cut or, something happening. And so the repatriation of the cross, the intent and motivation was sincere, was a sincere desire to address in some tiny minuscule way to restore some sense of responsibility for the loss and the harms that were done in Nagasaki by the United States government. But at the same time, I found myself getting caught up in, sort of the media attention and making the visibility, at times that became more important. And so I'm reflecting on that too. So Donna, I don't know if I really answered the kinds of narratives that you were thinking about, but those are some thoughts.
No, I think it gives me, I think it shows the complexity. And if you're thinking about writing something to delve into these areas, and I think the suggestion in the chat was maybe you could do one whole thing, combining them. I think it's food for thought. So many things, like I think how you've mentioned that there are other ulterior motives involved in people's actions. And it's not always, just to make things look good. There are always some underlying motivations. So I think that you've touched on a good way to kind of explore these areas in a little bit more depth, because so many of the things that we read and see today, we don't have time to really think more deeply. So yeah, I would encourage you to go ahead and write some more. And it will be a publication for the Peace Center.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's
Oh,
hard
yes,
when
there-
you, yeah, it's hard when you do something publicly to say exactly what you think should be said, put it that way, because you're in the middle of so many different stakeholders. You're sort of working with and need, and this isn't just about a repatriation, but any sort of large scale effort that involves social justice or
Mhm.
political sort of issues. So it was an experience for me to think about and reflect upon, you know, how could I use my voice most effectively amidst
Yeah.
um,
Well, you
being
know,
involved. Yeah.
what you write doesn't have to give the answers. It could
Yeah.
just, okay, here's, and as you showed in your presentation, there are many things that are unanswered. So you can just leave
Yeah.
it on the side of the reader to make their conclusions. So, but I think some writing that will, you know, delve more deeply into the various aspects is would be very, very interesting. Anyway, so you've got a good start.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate those comments. And I have a presentation for the article scheduled in November. So we'll see how that goes. It's going to have to be some fast writing, but I'll try to incorporate some of your thoughts and go a little bit deeper into those. And some of the comments that people have made here have been absolutely wonderful. So
Good. Keep us posted.
thank you.
Yes, please. So we have another comment in the chat from Kristen, who said, I used to know the Maruki artists of the Maruki Museum. They painted the Hiroshima panels and many paintings about the bombing of Nagasaki. They told me that the American government didn't allow any mention of the bombing until the mid-1950s. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is the United States immediately censored anything coming out of either city. There were several people, journalists, of course, Japanese photographers and journalists were documenting immediately. They were not allowed to publish those materials. Word did get out because we see word did get out fairly early because we have sort of classified documents of US military officers talking about how to do damage control and spin sort of news reports coming out of Japan about the extent of the devastation. So there was some, and some of the journalists managed, there's an Australian journalist, William Burchett, that managed to hide film and managed to get out a news story secretly out of Tokyo. And so there was, but by and large, and you know how much it takes to sort of get a news media story into the public and get a public attention even now. And those few efforts, were probably not a very significant, and the United States did censor until the 1950s, and then, continued to create a narrative that justified the use of atomic weapons very early on. In Harper's Magazine was the key narrative by Secretary of War Stimson that sort of went through in what seemed to be a very logical way the reasons why the United States had to use nuclear weapons in Japan. So that is true. And I've been thinking a lot as I teach my class lately about using the words atomic bombings. Like, shouldn't I just say nuclear attack? Like, why are we? So atomic bombings is historically the words that have been used, and there would be a loss in not using those words. But at the same time, when I'm asking my students to talk about, when I'm talking about this with my students, I'm starting to feel like I'd much rather say nuclear attack, because that's what it was, and that's what our students will understand. Whereas when you use atomic bombs, it's just sort of some archaic history that they don't have to grapple with. So I don't know. I'm curious to know if you've had any thoughts about that.
In some of my classes, I teach atomic bomb literature in some of my classes, and I have gone so far as to refer to them as a crime against humanity,
Yeah.
because I think that that kind of language does speak to students today, and kind of really they get more of the severity of it that way. So I've intentionally used language like that about atomic bomb literature, to just say that it's a crime against humanity, and that's the way we need to be talking about it. I have had students push back against that, but that's my 2 cents for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Do we have more question? Barbara, do you have another question or comment? You're muted. Can you please unmute?
Thank you. No, just in response to what Professor Mouse said, I think the other good reason, and probably this is what you've been thinking, so for using nuclear is because of the efforts of many people to oppose nuclear weapons. And I don't know the exact name, but ICON, the
International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
And so I think in that sense, and that's one of the people who's prominent in that. I think one might be Hibaksha, but another is a rather young woman. So I think students could relate to that very, very much. And there was just another comment I want to make. You showed the niece when she tried to, or they did succeed in sneaking into the Tennessee place. Well, recently NHK had a documentary about, and I didn't know anything about it. I had sort of read about it in British novels about how a group of British women tried to infiltrate a site in somewhere in Britain, maybe Brixton was it? And where the US had all these Pershing, or we're going to bring in Pershing missiles. And they did lions and sit-ins, and it was really a very moving documentary, and of something that I had just read about in British novels. We're going to the demonstration, but it hadn't really made an effect on me.
Yeah. I mean, it was really the nuclear activism of the 80s was really well throughout. It's actually that direct action was a really powerful means of resistance at that point. And women were really leading that charge. That's right.
Thank you so much for that. Do we have more questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question. I hear that in the United States, that Trump is really getting some support nowadays. Very unfortunate, I think, but many of my friends are very much worried about it.
Yeah.
Does your institution do anything? I don't know what to say, but any movement to, what should I say, promote the peace-oriented approach to politics rather than power and fight it and win it kind of approach?
I mean, we try. Let me tell you, we try. Institutionally, it's trickier. So the Peace Resource Center, of course, that's our mission. I mean, and Wilmington College is really interesting because it was founded by Quakers, and its faculty have been, there have been pacifists and Quakers, and quite radical pacifists actually have been among our faculty. So we have that legacy at the college. But recently, our college administrators, we're very dependent on student tuition. We're a tuition-driven institution. And we're right in the heart of rural Ohio. And we're in a pocket of very conservative student families and students. A lot of our students come from farming families. They're quite conservative. I think that we have a lot of white nationalism in our community. So there's sort of extremism in that regard. And we have had some pressure from our administration to tone down our peace activism and our messages, because we need the students and their tuition, and the students get angry. But we still push back, and we work at it as much as our time and energy allows. Yeah, and hoping that, I know that my classes reach students. I find it very meaningful to teach at that institution. I've had students come up to me and say, who I know are very conservative, who took the course, and come up to me and say, I just didn't know. I didn't understand. And now I understand. And one young man say, I've tried to talk to my family about this, but they refuse to hear me. But I've completely changed my understanding. So I know the work can be powerful when the message gets across, and not everybody receives it, but some do. So, yeah.
I think you are very courageous to say, to say something you told us like this, the same thing to your students, because, living in Tokyo, we are really surprised at how many shootings you have, students shooting people.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you feel unsafe? I would, if I was, living in the United States now, I would feel so unsafe.
I don't. It's a rural community. It's a small community. We actually have students who are licensed to carry on our campus. So they're allowed to bring in concealed weapons. I mean, in theory, they're not supposed to have them in their dorms, but they are licensed and they can have them in their vehicles. I just refuse to distrust everybody. My students come and go. I leave my office open all the time. I try to create a community of trust as much as I can among the students as soon as possible in our classroom, so that they can then feel comfortable sharing their views. And when they share views that appall me, I try to keep my face neutral and let them share, because that to me is a sign that we are in a community where they can express themselves freely.
Yeah.
And sometimes just saying your idea out loud in a community of people can be a space where you can reflect. And then allowing other people to say their views out loud without confrontation then allows you to hear and perhaps receive something else. So it's a very, very delicate operation, and one that's taken me, I still am not good at all the time, and it's taken me a long time to learn.
Yeah, that's really something I really admire about American society, that it's so courageous to keep it open. Well, in Japan, we are so conformistic. We try to conform to the general public. It's very easy in Japan to say, I'm against war, I'm against nuclear weapon, I'm against bombing, or, it's so easy because everybody believes in that. But in the States, you have a different situation where everybody can express their own opinion. And, to keep that kind of society is very courageous, I think.
This would probably take us the rest of the evening and a couple of bottles of wine to walk through.
Yeah, a couple of bottles of sake.
Thank you both for the really insightful questions and the really insightful comments. You've given me a lot to reflect on from the content and about teaching practice now too. We have another comment from Kristen about the Marukis. They spent their lives protesting nuclear arms. She gave us some links in the chat.
Oh,
So
thank
if
you
you're
so much.
interested, yeah, thank you very much for these links. We've got 3 links in the chat about their work and about the museum. So please do check those out. Do we have other questions or comments?
Go ahead.
Elizabeth? Yes?
Look ahead.
Wait just a second.
I think it might be a sign, Katie.
It might be a sign, right? But Elizabeth has another question, comment. Please go ahead, Elizabeth. We'll get you taken care of in a minute here.
I just wanted to repeat Kristen's question earlier. Will we be able to have access to this recording? I have a friend who is who's a priest in the Catholic Church, and I think that he would really love to hear this talk.
Yeah, I'm recording it and we'll pass it on to Donna. So please contact Donna for this.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I've had some inquiries about recording as well. So
Yeah, I would love to have a copy for the center. We'll put it in the collection. So
Sure.
all right. Do we have other comments or questions?
I could not hear at all.
Oh, what Elizabeth said?
Yes, yes.
Oh, she wants a recording
Sorry.
for people that she knows that can attend today. That's all. The recording of this session. So I said for her to contact you because I'm recording it and I'll send it.
Okay.
All right. Do we have other? Do we have other comments or questions? Thoughts?
Is the Friends World Center the one that is in Hiroshima now?
yes, that's right. It's the same center. They've gotten, you know, they've gotten very active lately. And one thing that COVID has done is given them, you know, Zoom is both horrible and wonderful. It creates so much demand on our times, but also it's given them, you know, a space where they can really do a lot of programming. And they have had a lot more sort of younger folks join the organization in the last couple of years, and their directors are just a fabulous, a couple of young men. It's the first time they've had 2 young men be directors of the World Friendship Center in their history, which is very exciting. Usually it's a married couple who directs the center, an older married couple. So that's bringing some unique perspectives. And I'm not sure if Malachy and David are married, but they are partners. And so that's bringing some new sort of perspectives and energy into the World Friendship Center. I'm guessing they're married because they're Church of the Brethren, but I'm not sure how it works. And I'm not, yeah, so.
Yeah, they've been very active online with a lot of events recently, and so has the Peace Resource Center. So I put links to both of the official websites in the chat just
Thank
now.
you.
But I mentioned this in the beginning, I'll mention it again now. The Peace Resource Center in particular is active across social media platforms. I'll put the handle in the chat too, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay, let me do that now then. Do we have other questions or comments? I'll put the Twitter in the chat and then the Instagram and the Facebook page for your center.
We kind of
And so-
come and go on Twitter. I would say Facebook and Instagram are sort of our main spaces.
Okay.
Yeah.
So please check those out and give them a follow if you're ever in Ohio. You can add Yellow Springs and Wilmington to your
Come
to-go.
visit us. Yeah, for sure.
Do we have any final thoughts or questions? Donna, Margaret, do we want to wrap up, or Elizabeth? Yeah.
So much for this talk. It was very, very informative. Although I had heard, I knew a little bit about the Murakami Church and the Christians and so on. I have never heard of this cross or the returning of the cross. So for me, this is really, really interesting, and thank you so much for presenting today.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I am very, honored that you have taken 2 hours out of your life to be here and to think about this together. Yeah.
Do we have any other final thoughts, comments, ideas?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I really
Thank you so
enjoyed
much,
it.
everybody.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that the 2 hours just flew away.
Yeah.
Thank
We
you.
could go on. We could go on and on with a
And
bottle of sake.
looking forward to reading your articles, Professor Mouse.
Yes,
Thank
when
you
you
so
much. It was
That's going to give me
fantastic.
some motivation. I'm going to think about this, and it's going to give me some good motivation.
yes.
Get
And
this
when
done.
you finish, please share them with us, and we can share them on our websites on social media as well, I think. So thank you so much again, all of you, for participating in today's chat. Thank you, Dr. Mouse, for your fascinating and really rich talk. I think we all learned a lot, and we're all walking away with a lot to think about. Again, feel free to follow on social media and continue this discussion in other platforms. We're looking forward to the article, so please keep in touch with us about that. And thank you for just a wonderful way to start our Sunday mornings or end our Saturday nights. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. I learned a lot from you as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you.